Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about research strategies for learning from big data sources. Specifically, we're going to talk about three different strategies to learn from big data. The first one is counting things. The second one is forecasting and nowcasting things. And the third one is approximating experiments. And those are the three main strategies. If we look at social science research that leverages big data sources, those are kind of the three main strategies that are being applied. So the first one, counting things. So one important thing to realize as we kind of also read a lot of social science research that potentially uses big data is that kind of beneath all the jargon and all the technical details, a lot of the research is ultimately just about kind of counting some quantity of interest, counting some measurable quantity. And that sounds relatively trivial, but ultimately, if you kind of look at the details, it's not trivial at all. What is important is, of course, the question is, what do we want to count, right? What is ultimately the quantity that we want to, or the measure that we want to quantify? And the important thing here is that big data sources often allow us to count certain things or kind of measure behaviors or measure certain outcomes that we otherwise previously weren't able to quantify. And in addition, that are interesting and important. What we mean by interesting is that they can reveal important insights into more general ideas about how, for example, social systems and social networks work. And what we mean by important is that they have some measurable impact, or the quantity themselves, or they feed into important decisions by policy makers. Okay, but what is key is that what makes these data, these projects, or the research interesting and important is not the data itself, but it's always kind of the underlying theoretical question, right? And so identifying, more important than identifying a cool new data source or a large data set. What is more important than identifying such a data source is to identify the key, interesting substantive questions that ultimately tell us something about, for example, a theory, or about broader, general questions about, society. Rather than just the data itself. So one example for that is the study by Henry Farber in 2015 in the quarterly Journal of Economics. I'm going to move myself up here for a second. Which was titled "Why You Can't Find a Taxi in the Rain and Other Labor Supply Lessons from Cab Drivers." And this specific study was based on records of cab, like an online cab company, and specifically it was data about basically the pricing of cabs and the activity of cab drivers, and basically how long cab drivers worked, how much kind of revenue they made at specific times, and the like. So there was a large data set, basically logging all trips that were made, how much they paid, how much tip people got, and therefore also how much revenues the cab drivers made in New York City over a long period of time. And so by itself, of course, that's a big data set. That's a lot of observations, but ultimately that in of itself doesn't make it necessarily interesting. What made this study interesting is that the author kind of leveraged these data to kind of examine a much bigger theoretical question. Specifically, what the author is interested in is kind of this comparison, or kind of examining the relationship between hourly wages and the hours worked. And the reason why that is interesting is because there are ultimately different theoretical predictions of how these two quantities should be related to each other. So the basic neoclassical kind of economic model would predict that drivers should work more on days that have higher hourly wages. So basically, of course, kind of supply and demand. If the price for a cab ride is high, then it's more profitable for cab drivers, so there should be more cab drivers, and they should ultimately work more. But ultimately, there's also kind of an opposing argument from behavioral economics, which suggests that if cab drivers are not necessarily just maximizing profit, but ultimately satisfying or kind of just working towards meeting a certain income target, then we should kind of observe the opposite pattern. We should observe that drivers drive less on days where prices are higher, because they're quicker in kind of meeting their income target. And so Farber used this large data set to answer this question that ultimately, of course, is interesting beyond the specific context of this data set. So that's one good example of why the study is not interesting because of the data source. It's interesting because what the data allows us to kind of say about a broader social question, right? In this specific study, Farber found that most drivers work more on days than when wages are higher, so that is consistent with this neoclassical theory. But beyond that overall statement, given that this was such a large data source and there were so many observations, what I mentioned in the previous video is that big data sources can be specifically useful when we want to study heterogeneity and different differences between specific defined groups. And so one thing that now I have to move myself down again. Oopsie. No. Sorry about that. One of the findings in this paper is that new drivers, this is now a figure from the paper, looking at wage elasticity of labor supply. So essentially, to what extent labor supply, so drivers driving in New York City is responsive to changes in pricing, right? So high elasticity means that that there's a stronger relationship between the price and the supply. So how many drivers are out there and how much they're working. And so this graph basically shows that new drivers, as they increase in experience and as they have a longer tenure as a driver, the elasticity increases, which means they're becoming more responsive to changing prices, consistent with this neoclassical model. So new drivers gradually learn to work more hours on high wage days. So they learn to behave as this neoclassical model predicts. And you can see this in this specific figure, but in the paper itself, there's also what Farber also finds is that new drivers who behave like more like these satisfying kind of or target earners are more likely to quit being taxi drivers and don't stick with it. So as I mentioned, the key to Farber's research was bringing an interesting question to this new kind of like available big data source. And this is a question that has larger implications beyond just the specific setting, right? So as you kind of think about your own research projects, and as you think about, you know, kind of data sources, or maybe you come across a specific data source outside of your project, what is important is to focus on kind of the interesting underlying questions, and not, you know, just focusing on, you know, what data is available alone. So this was an example of kind of a data source allowing you to kind of quantify something or measure something that previously wasn't easily quantifiable. In this case, the relationship between hourly wages and the supply for labor, which is important to economists, obviously. Another core research strategy is forecasting and nowcasting, or rather, specifically nowcasting. Ultimately, what we mean by nowcasting is kind of predicting the present. So, similar to this example of predicting income levels in rural areas in Rwanda that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. Nowcasting attempts to use ideas from kind of time series and forecasting to measure the current state of the world in kind of a more real-time manner that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So an example that is in the book and that is also very relevant kind of in today's environment is epidemiology. So specifically, there are a bunch of different papers, and the chapter kind of just focuses on one of them, but there is a larger number of papers in this area, and I really encourage you to check out some of those papers if that's interesting for you, that are focused on providing estimates of influenza epidemics using search engine query data. So using people's activity on the web, online, in order to provide more short-term estimates of, for example, influenza epidemics. So the background is that there is available data that is very accurate of, for example, influenza and the flu in the US that is provided by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. So they regularly and systematically collect information, in that case from selected doctors across the country. The problem with these data is not that they're inaccurate. The problem is that they have a substantial reporting lag. So they're not particularly fast in providing estimates of current infection levels, for example. So the idea is to use, rather than relying on this kind of slow but accurate official reporting mechanism, the idea of this paper and other papers is to use people's behavior, for example, Googling symptoms of or flu-like symptoms in order to predict how many people are actually, for example, infected by the flu. Based on the argument that if people get sick, what do? They go online and they, search for the symptoms and potentially, look up doctors and things like that, right? So in a sense, Google is also collecting data about influenza prevalence, but in a very different form. Because people from around the world kind of are constantly sending queries to Google. And if some of these queries, for example, about flu-like symptoms, increase in a certain area, we can assume that in that area, presumably, there are higher cases or higher case numbers of, for example, influenza. So here's one one example, one figure of the Ginsburg et al. 2009 paper, where they ultimately look at different time series of estimates. So this is comparing web-based predictions of influenza cases compared to the lag data that is available from the CDC using data available at different points in time in 2008 during a pandemic, during a specific, the 2007-2008 influenza season. So what you see is that the red line is the official data provided by the CDC, and the black line is our estimates based on Google search queries. And what you can see at any given point in time, let's see if I can, here for February 4th, 2008, and so on, March 3rd, 2008, there's, given the lag in the accurate CDC data, at each specific point in time, we have a much more current estimate of the infection rates here in the Mid-Atlantic region. And as we can see, as we kind of go further along over time, we see that those predictions were actually quite accurate. Okay, so that's ultimately quite the kind of optimistic, or ultimately, if this is accurate, this is a really useful tool, because ultimately it provides a much more kind of almost real-time estimate of important health outcomes that are important for policy makers, for obvious reasons. And there's a couple of papers that responded to this specific paper, because ultimately, while methods like these and nowcasting is really important, it's also there are potential pitfalls. And in this specific example, using this Google Flu Trends method, was that later papers showed that the Google Flu Trends performance was actually not much better than that of simple models that basically just extrapolated flu infection rates based on the previous CDC measurements. So you could come up with a much simpler model using much less data that was about as accurate, or even, sometimes even more accurate than this Google Flu Trends data set. The Google Flu Trends approach using search queries. And in addition, the ability to predict the CDC flu data was also prone to short-term failure and long-term decay because of drift and algorithmic confounding. So specifically, Google, for example, began suggesting related search terms when people started typing in flu-related symptoms, which ultimately made it, of course, more likely that people kind of entered search terms that included the clear references to the flu, and therefore the Google Flu Trends approach overestimated flu infection rates in kind of subsequent studies. The last research strategy, which is I think one of the most important ones and one of the most exciting ones, is approximating experiments, because most social science research questions but also policy questions are ultimately causal in nature. Ultimately, we're trying to explain or study causal mechanisms, or answer causal answer causal questions about underlying causal mechanisms. And of course, the well-known mantra that correlation is not equal causation also applies to applies to any observational data, but also applies to a lot of big data sources. But the nature of big data, and especially the fact that it is data that is continuously being collected and continuously being recorded, opens up a lot of opportunities to kind of approximate experiments in order to answer causal questions based on big data sources. Okay. And the first strategy to approximate experiments is to use what we call natural experiments. So specifically, we talked about this a little bit in our last Q&A session. Natural experiments basically entails looking for something happening in the world that randomly or nearly randomly assigns the treatment that we're interested in to some people and not others. So this could be over time or to specific regions and things or things like that, where we have a specific treatment and we're interested in the effect of that specific treatment, and we're looking for instances where, for example, there's a geographic discontinuity in who was exposed to some information or something like that. And the second method that is discussed in the bit-by-bit chapter is matching. But I mean, in principle, we could kind of, make a broader argument, not only focused on matching specifically, but in general, think about kind of different methods that statistically adjust non-experimental data in an attempt to... Oops, and I'm going to have to move myself up again. To account for pre-existing differences between observations that did or did not receive the treatment, right? So on the one hand, we're kind of trying to find exogenous variation in our treatment in order to understand or in order to answer these causal questions. And in the other case, we're trying to find observations that are as similar as possible on all other kind of characteristics, apart from the fact that one received the treatment and one didn't receive the treatment. So when we kind of put this on the spectrum of the strength of the causal estimates and the extent to which we can truly say that we're identifying a causal effect using big data, of course the gold standard is a randomized control experiment where we actually are able to randomly allocate treatment and control to specific observations and then compare both groups with each other. Natural experiments, depending on the specific context, can be relatively close to that if there's truly kind of random allocation. But that, of course, depends on the specific context, on how exactly the treatment allocation worked. And then, matching is further, away from this gold standard in the sense that now we have to rely on stronger assumptions, namely that we kind of account for all the potential confounding factors in order to estimate or reliably estimate causal effects. So let me talk briefly about natural experiments and why natural experiments are so important, or so kind of such a good opportunity when we think about big data sources. And the underlying reason is that as I mentioned in the previous video, that big data are usually always on data sources, so they're continuously being collected. And given that we have kind of continuously collected data, as soon as we have a random shock, as soon as we have some kind of intervention or some unexpected event occurring, like for example, now in the COVID pandemic, for example, ultimately we have a natural experiment, right? We have a random shock. Maybe that random shock is only affects a certain part of the population or of the observations, and given that we have continuously collected data, we can even in retrospect now analyze these data as a kind of natural experiment. And one example of what these random shocks can look like that is really nice is kind of an older example of the draft in the 1970s. Specifically, this is a picture of Congressman Alexander Perny drawing the first capsule of the Selective Service draft in 1969. This was, of course, for U.S. Men who had to go to Vietnam. And there was a draft, so depending on your birth day and month, there was basically a kind of a ranking of birthdays, and the higher up you were on the list, the more likely you were to be drafted to join the military. Joshua Angrist, in a well-known paper published in 1990, combined data from this draft lottery, because this draft lottery, of course, was basically random. People's birthdays are random. And so basically what we have here is we have a random allocation of people either having to serve in the military or they don't, depending on their kind of random birthday. And so in Angrist, what Angrist did was to combine this draft lottery and the birthdays with earnings data from the Social Security Administration to estimate the effect of military service on earnings. And so this is a great example of research using a natural experiment, because basically what we found here was a random, a truly random treatment allocation mechanism of the draft that allows us to answer the question how military service ultimately affects subsequent income. Lastly, just briefly, I want to talk about, and I have to move myself down again. I just want to talk briefly about matching. Just one thing, since we're not going to talk about matching methods in too much detail, there are a lot of different kind of methods that we don't have to go into in too much detail, but the underlying idea, just to have a basic understanding, is to kind of look through non-experimental data to create pairs of observations that are as similar as possible on kind of all other characteristics except for whether they received the treatment or haven't received the treatment, right? So in the context of the draft that I just mentioned, imagine the draft wasn't random, but people were, or we didn't have information of who was randomly allocated to going to the military or not. What the idea of matching would be to find, for example, two people who are as similar as possible on all social demographic characteristics, except for the fact that one went to the military and the other one did not, and then kind of looking at their differences across a large number of observations. There are two big caveats with matching methods. The first one is that estimates from matching apply only to the matched data. So depending on the matching method, ultimately what we're doing is we're potentially throwing away data that we can't find a pair for. So we're kind of pruning the data to some extent. And of course, there are different matching methods, so this is not necessarily true for all matching methods, but to the extent that we're kind of only like looking at a subset of observations for which we can actually find a match that had or didn't have the treatment. Ultimately, the estimates that we compute only apply to the cases that could be matched and not to the ones that couldn't be matched. The second caveat is that matching estimates can be biased by unobserved confounders, right? So this is always important to keep in mind. These are statistical methods that try to adjust for potential confounding factors that affect, your outcome variable. And so they're only good to the extent that we're able to observe and account for all possible confounders. So overall, for many social scientists, ultimately matching is kind of only second best to experiment. But despite kind of these drawbacks, matching can be useful and potentially even more advantageous than kind of a small number of field experiments. For example, when we want to study heterogeneity, and so we need big data and can't necessarily run an experiment. And secondly, if we do have all the important variables that are needed for matching, then it can actually be a very useful technique. All right. In the last video, I'm going to talk more about kind of causal inference and kind of the mathematical foundation to characterize causal effects.